I'm excited to introduce our guests today who are speaking on this webinar, Chris Pandolfi and Hiba Abdallah. If you're able to come on video and say hi to everyone joining us today. So Hiba and Chris, years of experience in community engaged art, and I'm so excited to learn alongside them today. Hibba is an artist, organizer, and teacher with her work focused on exploring structural legacies and the future of cities. And Chris is the co-founder and creative director of Department of Unusual Certainties, as well as a teacher and advisor. His work uses design and design methods to help shape the future of society. So welcome, Hibba and Chris.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Wonderful. So I'd love to just bring a little bit of context as to why I'm so excited to have Hiba and Chris here today. I'm an artist myself and also a community engagement practitioner. And I just think that the arts has a significant role to play in community engagement. But I often feel that when it is used in community engagement practices, that it's often kind of an add-on or oh, let's make this a little bit more engaging. Let's have a art activity. And it's so often an afterthought or, you know, that add-on rather than the main thing, rather than arts being a process by which we're doing the engagement. And so I think just collectively, we have a lot that we can learn. And one of the ways that I'm hoping to do that is, you know, in this conversation today with Hiba and Chris, I'm hoping that they can share some stories and examples that inspire us. And then I'm hoping to have some conversations about, you know, what are the barriers or what makes it difficult? What are some of the things that may be holding us back from embracing and using arts-based practices more? So those are some of my goals today. And I want to thank you, Hiba and Chris, for being here.
Thank you.
It'll
be great.
Wonderful. Well, as we get started, I wonder, Hiba and Chris, if you're able to share your perspectives on what makes arts-based practices unique from traditional approaches. You know, what can they offer that perhaps traditional approaches can't? And I know you both have examples to share. So perhaps if you can, you know, go in turn and perhaps share your perspectives and share an example as you go. So Hiba, why don't you get us started?
Sure, that sounds great. I'm just gonna share my screen. Can everyone see that? So I have been working in this way for over a decade now. This idea of community engaged practice or social practice or art with a civic kind of centrality. And so for me, the kind of main thesis or idea behind a lot of the work that I do is finding something that's worthwhile. And that can be quite an abstract idea, or it can be a really focused one. But I had my start as an artist working with a collective of artists and creatives and musicians and thinkers. And we were based out of Windsor, Ontario, and our collective was called Broken City Lab. And essentially what we did as a lab is we made spaces to gather, and we made spaces to gather together. We made spaces to gather with others in the community, and we made space to talk about issues that were important to us, the things that were worth our while. And I think that creating that space is really, really central to this type of practice. It affords a type of flexibility and curiosity around community building that really has no bounds. I think art allows that to take place in a different way. And so this practice of gathering and discussing and brainstorming is really, really important to the processes that we build as artists who work in this way. And that becomes really pivotal to how the work or the transformation takes place. So for example, really early on as a collective, we collaborated with some high school physics students because we wanted to do this project, but we had no idea about the type of scale or power that we would need to do it. So we worked with a local high school group of physics students to help us figure this out. And so then we figured out what type of projector we needed, what type of power we needed, and what type of building we needed to have a conversation between Windsor and Detroit. Which back when this was happening in 2008, both economies were essentially collapsed. And the history between these two places is quite interesting because they are two separate countries, but they're also so integrated as cities because of industry and because of proximity. So we wanted to have a conversation with Detroit. And with the help of these high school students, we were able to do it. So this was directly facing Detroit. This is the view from Detroit. And what happens is that this type of work opens up the conversation for a larger community space to talk about the issues that were happening in these two communities. And I think that what we've done as we moved as a collective is really, really open up these places to have these civic discussions about our social, economic, cultural, everything community based around ideas of art and civic participation. So in 2012, we opted for a more permanent space to have these conversations. And so we were able to rent a storefront in Windsor and we called it Civic Space. And in this place, we, hosted exhibitions, we hosted artist residencies, we hosted more traditional art exhibitions, we hosted jam making sessions, we learned about gardening, we learned about other types of ways of trading skills, we made zines, we hosted silkscreen parties in solidarity with May Day. We even had a pop-up tattoo shop that really embraced the ideas around what makes Windsor great and what makes Windsor an important community to kind of to pay attention to. And so see, these are just some examples of how I've worked over the years in bringing art and civic ideas together. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks so much, Hibba. Oh, I'm so inspired already. I'm excited to dig into the conversation. But Chris, why don't you go ahead and share a little bit about you and your work and some examples
Sure.
as well.
1 second. And you can see my screen? Oh, that didn't work really well. Give me 1 second. There you go. Okay, hi everybody. So my name's Chris Pandolfi. I represent the studio called Department of Unusual Certainties, and I think it's the first project I want to show is because it's how Hibba and me know how we met each other. So my studio actually was an artist on a number of times for Broken City Lab. We would go and make a number of different projects during some of their artist residencies. But I guess my background's also a little bit different. I've been kind of between the art and design world for quite a long time, maybe most of my career, where sometimes artists don't think I'm an artist and sometimes designers don't think I'm a designer. So it's really a funny place of like, what am I actually making, and trying to figure that out. But my kind of background in community engagement or arts community engagement is I actually have a background in urban planning and urban design, and so seeing how the engagement processes firsthand were done at kind of like integrated into the city kind of led me to understand that okay, this is not necessarily the way that we can do things, and there's more interesting ways. So the first kind of thing that I wanted to show, this is a project that we made in Windsor for Broken City Lab's first ever residency. And we called this Storefront Success Story. So DOUC went down to Windsor and essentially set up office in a vacant storefront that Broken City was curating, Broken City Lab was curating. And we really wanted to know about what defines success for downtown store owners. There was a lot of narratives around downtown Windsor being a vacant place, that it was failing and all of these things. And we were like, we just want to make a project to understand and learn about these people that own small businesses in Windsor. So we essentially walked around all of downtown and documented every single storefront, the types of businesses that it had. We introduced ourselves to every single business owner, provided them with a letter, just saying the kind of project we were making. And eventually what happened is we got really involved with the business community, because a local kind of champion, Tom, who owns Fog Lounge, kind of took us under his wing and we're like, hey, like, I want to work with you. So this is kind of our real first project. And what we really learned from this was that, you know, true community engagement doesn't come from a process that we design. It came from the idea of we were designing a process as we were learning along, like allowing the community itself to design the process that we would go through. So eventually, you know, all of these things led to all of these conversations that we were having with small business owners. We just found out that many of the small business owners didn't even know each other. Like, we had made this assumption because they were all downtown, that they all knew each other. So we created an event, and this was like over 10 years, 11 years ago now, called Speed Dating for Store Owners. And basically it got all the store owners together in one room, like over 25 of them. And it was really interesting because it was like really the first time they ever had the opportunity to share their concerns about what downtown meant to them, like, and what they could do to change it. And what we ended up from the project was creating this like tip sheet that we ended up handing back to the city of Windsor, which was all the stories and advice that the store owners were giving us about what it meant to open up a business in Windsor. And so that this tip sheet could then be handed back. So if you were thinking about opening up a new business in Windsor, you basically had all this advice from store owners that were already there. So, and some of the other stuff is, you know, the next thing is like being engaged with the community. And I've been really lucky enough to work with a community hub in Sutton called The Link, for a number of different projects. And I think, you know, the big learning from here was around, again, we're kind of creating these like structured processes for people. But it was really where I think for the studio, we really understood that the major thing about engaging people was going to be around this idea of how people experience and feel things. Like, how do we put that at the forefront of everything that we want to learn? And so this was like an exercise that we did with stakeholders at the Link, the people who ran these organizations like a hospice, an art gallery, food pantry. And we worked with them because we were going to be designing a new public space. And so what we really wanted to understand was like what their lives were like. And so these were we called these like their rivers of their lives, and essentially was a timeline of their life over the past years, looking at different lenses through financial security, their health, how they loved, how they played, how they learned. And it was a really powerful experience because like the stories that people shared not only went on to help us think about how we would design the project, but it also got the other community members to really start to learn a little bit deeper about who the people they were basically neighbors with. And this event turned into another thing we called like a collage party, where we engaged a larger community around this kind of, like we said, like shop for services. So we created like this little shopping mall where they could go and look at the different different organizations that were in the Link, and start to look at their different services and start to create like this mashup of different collages of services that they could do. And what this actually gave us ideas and for the organization is to think about better shared resources between the different organizations. Because the reality is, when you're dealing with certain different types of communities, a lot of the clients for a lot of these like food pantries or hospice, that the same clients use and share the different services. And the problem is that sometimes there's no communication between them, and people don't understand where we can like actually create better community services by just understanding who's coming to them. And so this was like another kind of thing. And lastly, the last example of the Link was we went back there a couple of years ago again, and we were really interested in understanding how augmented reality could kind of like be part of the Link and enhance different kind of experiences for both the organizations and the community clients that were using it. And so really this project was for a community garden that we had designed for the food pantry. And what we ended up doing was creating an AR app that would actually help people better understand the different vegetables that were growing in the garden, because it was actually vegetables from like different parts of the world, and people just didn't know what to do with them. So it was also like this way to like share culture and share experiences by like giving people like additional information and kind of creating this like accessible app that was also like, if you couldn't see, you could listen and hear the recipes and these kinds of things. So yeah, these are like just some projects that like really just like help to understand, I think, like what the studio's mentality and goal when we think about experiences and feelings and like what it means to let a process kind of design itself. Sorry, I ran over a little bit. Apologize.
No, you are all good. And I say throughout, whenever we can illustrate with a story, I just think that will help us all to kind of grasp what's possible. I was kind of noticing and writing some notes around, what are some of the things that these arts-based practices, what does it enable that traditional community engagement may not? And so some of the things that I was hearing from your stories was, one, that it animates the conversation more. So, with the collage, with the, getting people together, you're making whatever you're talking about more alive. So that was one. Another one was the emotional connection. I think about Hibba with the messages on the building, that evokes more emotion than a written report about how people were feeling. And that emotional connection is something that I noted. Another one is creating a shared experience, and we know that when people do something together that is memorable, that it builds connection between people. So those were three that I kind of gathered through your stories. I'm wondering if you have other things that kind of stand out for you that that makes art-based practices unique compared to traditional community engagement.
Yeah, so I think that what I'll say is that I think it allows the opportunity to throw all the rules out the window. So when we're talking about changing the ways that we're going to, we're going to come together as a community, we're going to decide that something, like whatever the topic is, whatever the thing is, needs to change or needs to be gone about a different way. And I think that artists are really good at shifting the parameters that we work under and saying, you know what, we're going to start from like fresh, like let's pretend these structures don't exist. And that use of imagination and that use of creativity in rethinking like civic structures is so beneficial, because you're not working against things that are already in place, like policy and bylaws, which of course you have to deal with at some point. But I've just found that when I've worked with municipalities, a lot of times they'll be like, oh, well, we can't do that because of this, we can't do that because of that. And I'm just like, okay, well, let's pretend those things are actually not there, and like dream as big as we want, and then work back from there to work with the things that are in place that are really hard. So I've just found that use of creativity and approach is really, really helpful in these types of spaces and conversations.
I was thinking about, who would have approved a pop-up tattoo shop, right? If you weren't willing to throw out all the rules. I love it. What about you, Chris?
I think it's to a lot of Hibba's points. I think from our end too, from the studio, it's that it's this idea of, it's like no matter what we're doing, it's like the experience is more important than the outcome, if that makes sense, like in the process. And I think that the way that engagement is set up, and when you're taking like a different approach, like we call it arts engagement, but I think what me and Hibba want to really talk about today is like a different approach to public engagement, not this bucket of arts engagement versus standard engagement, but like a transformation of what engagement looks like. Is that, it's always about doing something. There's always this necessity to have to do something, right? Like, oh, we're going to design a space, or we're going to change this thing, and we're going to engage people in order to do that. Is that when you take these kind of more imaginary approaches, or just approaches of like, we don't need to do something, but what we need to do is work on the process of how we even think and work together as a community first. These processes open that up, because what it takes away is the pressure, not just from the residents to make these decisions of like, this is what we want or what we don't want. And I'll get into some points about that afterwards. But more what it does is it takes the pressure off of everybody involved in a project to first understand, what is our community? What is it? What are the voices we need to be listening to? What's been missed? And When the process is put before the outcome, these are the kinds of things you learn. So it's not even the things you get, but it's more that the learning that happens is essentially embedded in this kind of thinking. You're going to learn more. So for me, that's like a big thing, if that makes any sense to people. So
yeah, I think that's a pretty massive one, you know, that saying that the learning will be greater, and I believe it. But I think, you know, that might be a good segue actually into the next questions I have is around what are some of those barriers? You know, you say, wow, this is going to be more powerful, you know, trust me, believe me, we're going to focus on the process. But I'm sure you both have experiences where, you know, you probably spent way too much time trying to validate and explain what you were hoping and dreaming for, and it kind of got met with blank faces. And so, you know, if that's true, I would love to hear more and hear more about some of the barriers or the misconceptions that you have felt. Whoever wants to go first.
Hibba.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so for example, like what I was kind of talking about earlier with my experience working in Windsor, you know, I didn't always have a relationship with the city of Windsor. I didn't have a relationship with the councilors and people working in that space. I had to build that relationship over time. So I would say that in the beginning, BCL was actually seen as a nuisance to the city, maybe. And we didn't exactly see eye to eye on a lot of things. And it took a while to build up a relationship with them to understand that actually our core values are the same. We are both interested in investing time and putting forward the best resources for our community. So getting to the point of realizing that took some finessing. And I think that that's where some of the challenges arise. You know, I think maybe one of the most kind of typical things I hear is like, well, like you're not a policymaker, like you're not a policy advisor, you don't work for the city, you don't like have this type of experience. And that's totally true. But I have a different set of experiences and a different set of insight that I think is valuable to these types of spaces, to these types of institutions, organizations, and structures, that is not meant to actually erase what's in place, but it's actually an addition to make it stronger, to make it more dynamic, to make it more robust in a way. And so I think that a lot of times I've faced challenges about like, you know, how to get a seat at the table, and also how to bring the community members who also have valuable experiences and skills that are outside of mine to that same conversation. And so, you know, in Windsor, it took like maybe 3 or 4 years to really build up a strong relationship with the city. And it was like working with people like Chris and DOUC and bringing other artists and bringing other thinkers into that space to show like, look, these are examples of how things can be different. Like when you engage the businesses downtown, when you engage the members of the neighborhood, you can really empower them to put forward their experiences, which is essentially what a lot of municipalities are looking for. They're looking for feedback. And this feedback most of the time takes the form of a survey, which I just don't think is always like suitable for the circumstance, and that there's more fun and creative and engaging ways to bring about that response from a community that I think can bring lots of value when a city is about to make decisions about a certain neighborhood or a community center and things of this nature. So there's always like to some degree a bit of tension, but I also think that that's where artists like us are really good at working that. It's a part of what we do. It's a part of our practice, this form of communication and negotiation around these ideas.
And I think to pick up a little bit on this point of tension, there should be tension. I mean, the idea that like, if I come to you and say, oh, the way I'm going to do this is better than the way that you're doing it, you should automatically be like, who are you? Like that, and tension is also democracy. So if we're really trying to strengthen a democracy, this kind of tension is good, right? And this is why, we work really well with it. I think from that, it's, you know, it's about time. There's this other thing about time that I've also learned from this process. It's like the quickness and the slowness of things. And I think sometimes is that processes that are very structured, there is this kind of like idea that time is going to move at a different pace. And what I found is that working with community groups and working with, let's say like organizations or like proper structured organizations, is that in a community group, something can happen very fast. Like something that could take an organization to shift a year can happen within a week. At the same time, something that can take an organization 1 month to do might take a community a year to do, because it's about the importance and value around the types of decisions that are being made. And so one of the biggest barriers is to understand that time is not something that moves in these chunks of a phased project. That when you're working with communities, time works really differently, because it's about people coming together to understand their values and how those values are driving the decisions that they make. And some days we can do that in one meeting, and other days it's going to take 3 months to get there. And that's about commitment to the change, and understanding that, like, and that's hard to do, right? That's hard to do when you got engineering contracts. That's hard to do when you have to check a lot of boxes with certain types of liability in projects. Like I completely understand that, and it's like me and Hibba have talked about. It's like something that we understand, but at the same time, you know, this idea of engaging people in a different way also involves in viewing how we make things, and the time and the processes also in different ways. So for me, like, the barrier will always be around, like, not just explaining that, because I think people understand that actually at their core. I think they really know that, because they're also, like, everybody's also a human and understands how things are. But I think it's like how the different systems don't necessarily give the agency to allow even people to change to begin with. And that's really a conversation that is being had and is going to constantly be had in the next few years, because it's just obvious for so many different reasons.
Yeah, and just to quickly add like one other point to what Chris said, because it's everything, I agree 100% with what he's saying, but it's, you know, a tip or like a trick that I've learned over the years that I find to be really helpful in these scenarios is from the beginning, like setting out expectations and setting out, like, not goals, because like we were saying, the process is going to lead to that endpoint, and it's really important to let that process guide it. But I mean expectations, and really understanding, are we thinking about these terms in the same way? When I say community arts, it's like, I'm sure that how I interpret that versus how you might interpret it is different. So let's set the precedent and make sure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about process, when we're talking about time, when we're talking about commitment, all of these things. It's really important that we have a kind of unified understanding of what that is from the beginning, because setting those intentions is so vital, so that we all know what it is that we're working towards and what we're committed to.
And I think, like, just to pick up a little bit on that point, it's one of the points that I kind of wanted to make today, but I think it's good, is that looking at like those expectations and then understanding the expectations of a different process and a process that's already embedded in the system. And so, like, these kinds of engagement processes that are already embedded in the system, they're made to ensure that the system still operates. So you're not necessarily going to get different things, even if you try. So even if you come up with creative ways, like how to engage people, like, hey, look, we're going to use like Legos in this engagement, and we're going to do these things, you might learn different things. But if the engagement process has still been designed, embedded in that system, the difference that it can make, it's really harder for that engagement to work for you to actually include what people say, because the engagement was designed by the system in which you're trying to change. So that's like a little bit, that's like, for me, it's just a barrier to begin with. So it doesn't matter even how creative your ideas can become around engagement. It's still going to be, if it doesn't understand how to tackle like the system itself, then it's just problems from there. And I think, you know, this idea of like the artist engagement, where the artist is working outside the system or viewing the system from the outside, and then flowing and then allowing to create processes that can then kind of like intentionally like leak into the system or like engage with the system, it allows for difference to actually occur, if that makes sense.
I'm curious about, you know, that place that the artist can operate. You know, you were speaking to, if they're outside the system, here's what it can enable. Have you found success when the artist is working within the system and, you know, given a place at the table, and, you know, what might that look like?
Yeah, so I mean, I can give a really like strong example, which is, you know, the whole formation of civic space. This is an artist-run space. It's one of the first artist-run spaces that was ever funded by the Ontario Trillium Foundation. And that, for us, was the whole point of the project. Like, all of the engagement, all of the artists, all of the community members that we collaborated with over those 2 years, those were just incredible additions that we built off of. But the core idea was, we saw as young artists that funding is very sparse, that having big ideas can only take you so far, because at the end of the day, we need money to make things. And so for us, the real hard work was working with those Trillium officers, was working with the city to convince them that this is a project that you should fund. And here are the reasons why. And here's our track record of the types of work that we've done. And we really think you should take a chance on this project. And thankfully they did. But I think that what's really, really important for me about that is that now the Ontario Trillium Foundation funds arts all the time. They fund a lot of different art projects now because they've seen an example of what can happen when you try something different. And so I think that breaking these molds, like Chris is referring to, these structures, and really doing that behind the scenes work that a lot of time artists like ourselves don't get to actually talk about, because it's just like all happening behind closed doors, is in essence a lot of the work. It's convincing other players to take part in something that we see as being important, but that they might not see as being as important at that time. But there's ways to slowly change those ideas and behaviors. And now, you know, like the Ontario Trillium Foundation has funded over 5 projects in Windsor alone, and many across the GTA. And so I think that it's really a lot of back end work as well.
It really, it shows the power of, you know, doing something once and demonstrating that. And, you know, as you've spoken to, building those relationships and trust to be able to do more together. I'm wondering if you can both share a little bit more about what a process. What's my question? So you've both spoken about how the output is something that you can't determine in advance. You know, that's something that you learn through the work. You know, and from your story earlier, Chris, about that tip sheet that you produced, you know, there wasn't some RFP at the beginning of the project asking you to create a tip sheet. That's just something that emerged out of need, out of conversation, out of the work. And so I'm wondering, you know, what might that process look like? Not the process of the project, but the process of the conversations to determine, you know, what are our intentions? What are we seeking to do together, so that people can let go of the output?
That's a good question. But do you want me to try to answer first? Do you want to
go for it?
Okay, I think okay, so I guess like, it's not magic. I just want to say that, right? Like, it's not like, I mean, I wish I was on the thing, I could get up. It's like you just show up. It's like, oh, process. Like, it's not that. And I think actually it's really important to distinct that, because it's not like, sometimes artists get this what's the word I'm looking for, like a reputation of like, they're just going to do something. And I think that like we're kind of saying that, but that's not what we're talking about. Like, for us, engagement, when we're talking about engagement is a project in itself. So for us, we're not coming there unprepared. Like, you start by doing your background research. You talk to people, you visit the community even before the process starts. You're talking to different stakeholders who are involved. And you know, you want to start a process. Like, for us, we always like generally start something around trying to understand people's values and their emotions and feelings. So we're going to design a couple of workshops or ways to engage people around these 3 things. And from there, that's our second bit of learning, right? So we have this secondary learning where it's primary because we're talking to people, right? It's giving us ideas, thinking about what we're doing. But then there's this other thing where we're creating a kind of structured exploration or an engagement with people, where we're kind of looking at these first 3 things. And then what this allows us to do is work with the community, right, to then plot forward what could happen from there. What's the next thing that we need to look at? And as we're moving, right, we're not checking a box. What we're doing is we're checking in with people around what's the right thing to do, what's the next step, right? So you can come in with this kind of like co-design process, but a co-design process that not the project is co-designed, but the process can become co-designed. In other cases, you might only be able to engage in the community in 3 or 4 times. So what you want to do is hit your big points and design a series of workshops of like what you're trying to get, but also be prepared to completely shift. And I think that's the other thing, like with the studio, it's like we show up with a plan sometimes, and then within 5 minutes, we just like, sorry, I was going to swear, but it's like, yo, forget this. We're going to do this instead. Like, it's like, we're just, because this is a better thing to do, because 5 people have just said, this is something that needs to change. And it's like, boom, let's work on that. And it's about being flexible for those things. Sorry, I went a little bit over.
All good.
I don't know if that makes sense, if that's answering the question, but.
It does. It sounds to me, and this is likely an oversimplification, but there's always an exploration phase, you know, where you're learning and wanting to figure out what it is that is most important to the people that you're engaging with, and being really responsive to that.
Yeah, I think so. And I also think that it's like trusting people's experience. Like it's one thing to be asked as a community member to come to like a community conversation with a local counselor around like housing. Like that's kind of intimidating because maybe I don't know all my rights as a tenant or as a landowner or all of that kind of like talk. But it's another thing to come to a conversation where you're just being asked to share your experience of living in a neighborhood. It's like, what's it been like for you living in this place? You've lived here for 30 years. Like, tell me about that. And I think that it's to what Chris is saying about like, let's talk about emotion and feeling and intuition as opposed to the structures or like laws and policies that are kind of separate. And so I think that, this is something I experienced when the city of Calgary asked me and some of my collaborators at Broken City Lab to come and talk about the water, because at the time Calgary had flooded and it was causing major damage to a lot of buildings and homes, and the city was trying to convince its residents to move away from the water. But like, this is a very complicated thing to do. And so they literally just asked us to come as artists to observe and report on the relationship that people have to the water and why it's become this way. And this turned into a report and a series of art projects that the city now refers to when they're trying to build policy or introduce new restrictions around access to the rivers in Calgary. And so again, this is like a way to literally just come in as an observer, as an artist, as a person who's thinking differently, and then suggest to a municipality or an organization, like, this is what your residents are saying, this is what the neighborhood is asking for. And kind of playing that like almost like moderator or mediator between the two.
I love that so much. And, as I think about, for me, we have to have artists in these spaces when we're looking to imagine a different future, when we're looking to do things differently, when we're looking to foster greater connection. That is what the arts does. And so artists are our vehicle for that. Anyway, thank you for that. I'm seeing a lot of questions come in the Q&A box, and so I want to have enough time to get to those. And for everybody on this session today, if you open the Q&A box, you can kind of upvote the questions that you want us to respond to first. But just one last thing before we get there, I'm wondering if each of you can share a piece of advice for those who are looking to integrate the arts, use the arts for their community engagement that they, have ahead of them this year. What advice do you have for people who want to embrace this mindset shift?
That's a great question. I mean, I think a piece of advice, well, a couple of different things actually. I would say never believe that anything is permanent. I really hate when people say that to me, that like, this is just the way it is. And that's kind of how we have, and it's like, no, you know, these structures or these ideas were built by someone or people in the past. And so they can be changed by people as well. So that's something that I really hold hard and true. And the other thing is, again, like setting expectations and intentions from the beginning, because, you know, something even like Chris and DOC and I had like recently experienced is like, you know, when you're working with developers or city or community, everyone has different ideas around the word engagement and what that means, especially when you're bringing artists to the table. And that can cause a lot of problems and be really, really problematic. So I think setting that from the beginning, like, and making sure that we're all on the same page and that we're committed, that we all want to see this through. We all want to see this process through together, collectively, and always have that kind of openness and transparency.
I guess 2 points. One, arts engagement is not, and this is not slamming anything, it's just like a thing. Arts engagement doesn't end, all roads don't, we have a joke that we say, all roads do not lead to a maquette, which means that not everything in an arts engagement needs to lead to like a public sculpture or a mural. That's not arts engagement. That is a piece of artwork in public space. There is an engagement that can happen in order to get that there, but like, just don't confuse the two. If you want a public art project, public art's great. How will you get that? If you want a community engaged piece of art, I would then ask, if somebody is presenting you a process, because everybody here can look at a process and make a decision. If that process, if you look through it and it's more about people reacting to something as opposed to creating something, it's not a publicly engaged process by any means. And that's just like a rule that I have about anything. So it's like, if you look and it's like, the community will comment on this, the community will comment on that. Like, that's a reactionary process. And I think that if that's being presented to you, push that. Ask where is the community creating? What is this process actually creating beyond this final piece of public art or beyond this public space? Like, what are we learning from the process, and how is the process creating itself from the next steps? This for me is like the two things I would say.
Thank you so much. All right, we have lots of questions to respond to, and my colleague Duncan has been keeping an eye on the Q&A box, and I'm wondering if you can bring forward the questions that are rising to the top.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Really excited to look through this list of questions. This is the best, like most animated list of questions I think I've seen. I don't think I've ever seen a question with 20 thumbs up, so it's incredible to see. The question overwhelmingly voted by the audience comes from Laddie, and they ask, what advice do you have for non-artists who work in community engagement who want to support arts-based practices?
What do I have to say about that? Let me just look at this question again. Non-artists who work in community. Yeah, I mean, I think advice would be to find, it's kind of like the same you know, tips that Chris just gave. It's like really push up against, you know, these types of applications, or even if you're just doing research about artists that you might be interested in engaging or reaching out to. I think that there's a lot of talk going around, and honestly, community engaged art has become this like trend or buzzword. And I think that it's really important to in a way like screen this stuff and make sure that you're working with artists who are invested in the process of engagement, who are invested in, you know, advocating for communities and whatever kind of organizations you're working for, and that's the core of their practice, as opposed to the output version that's more kind of related to public art, which is very needed and important, but it's very, very different. And so I think I've seen a lot of examples where artists kind of dive into that realm and are, you know, like in over their heads, because they don't realize the like magnitude of what it means to be working with a community. Like that is my practice. That is what I do. I'm not as concerned with the output. I'm concerned with the engagement process itself. And so I think it's really important to do that research and to make sure that you're reaching out to the right people.
Yeah, it's the same thing. I was going to make a joke, be like, hire an engagement artist, like hire an artist who does engagement. And I know that's like a funny quip, and this question is actually very serious, because actually, if you think about it, you know, it means that if you decide to put importance and value on something, you know, that's how you start to build out teams, right? And like, for example, like at the city, no one will like put up a big fuss if you hire Deloitte to do like some economic analysis of something, to do something, because they're professionals and they have the expertise to do that. And the idea is that it's reframing how we look at arts engagement and the different types of artists in the field, and understand, no, they're professionals. They know how to do this kind of work. And what they're doing is they're adding to your team this professional expertise. It's not saying that 100% you have to change everything. It's understanding that you're bringing somebody on your team that can help you build an engagement process with that perspective and that expertise. So it's also like about not, if it's a nice to have, we know that nice to haves leave budgets, but if it's a must have, we've got to start building the different tools at all scales to understand how we can integrate people in that. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you both. That's really powerful. Our next question comes from an anonymous attendee. May I ask, do you have any ideas or suggestions for encouraging this type of community engagement on virtual platforms specifically? As a library programmer working in a maker space, we are finding it challenging to encourage participation online. And I'll just add one comment we got from Sheila in the chat that touches on this, specifically regarding creating space for introverts to speak out within a virtual space as well.
Yeah, that's a really great question, because and it's one that I think I hold close to me, because I am like really shy and like really introverted actually. So it's sometimes people think it's crazy that I do this work, but I think that it's a great thing to bring up, because there's a range of what this type of engagement can look like and what it can be. Of course, we're now all faced with the challenge of using online platforms for engagement, and I have, you know, my own kind of challenges with it, and I find it a lot more difficult, of course, to work with people in this way. But you know, one thing that I have like loved doing over the last few years for people who might be like too shy to like speak up, you know, in a forum like this or ask a question, is to give an opportunity for like something that can happen after. And, you know, sometimes like prompts, like I've done a lot of work in like Scarborough, for instance, where I have asked participants and community members to write me a love letter about Scarborough, like, "Dear Scarborough," you know, and just tell me what they think. And some of these letters were actually way better than some of the feedback I had received in the actual workshops that I was hosting, because it allowed for time not only to like reflect on what was like being said and time to process it, but also to feel maybe a little bit more confident or like empowered to say what you feel when you're writing like pen to paper or on the computer. I found it to be like a really lovely way to allow someone some space to engage.
I'll always be very honest. It's really difficult to one thing that you need to immediately lose with this idea of online is you're not recreating what happens in person. So that's not like, you just need to understand that if you're trying to recreate an experience like the way that it is, then it already becomes problematic. It's just difficult because it's the nuance, right? For example, I'm using my hands a lot, and the people that work in my studio are probably telling me that it's super annoying that I'm moving my hands so much on a screen. But when I'm in person with people, usually sometimes it makes them feel a little bit more comfortable because I'm kind of giving off this body language. So that's probably something for me to remember. But the way that I would think about it is that I don't think that I'm not going to say like, this is exactly what you do, but you know, when we're designing processes in the studio, we think about these things about like self-reflection, think, what are ways to allow people to self-reflect? What are the different activities or ways that we can give time for self-reflection? Then from there, what are some ways that we can create self-awareness about that self-reflection, right? Like to build on. And then finally, like self-action, right? So it's like when you're designing these online processes, what that does is it gives people both individual and group time, right? Whether you're using some online tools like Miro, or you just have a chat and a shared document, right? But like thinking about self-reflection, self-awareness, and self-action in the way that you kind of design things, or like even a meeting, I find really helps out a lot, right? And dealing with people who are introverts. So I'm not an introvert. I'm very jealous of introverts because I always want to be them. Because like I'll be quite honest with you, I don't like talking all the time, but somehow I end up doing it because people are like, just do it, Chris. But you know, through my life, I've worked very closely with a lot of people who were like this, and this idea of people not being heard. What's really important in processes is that you're always designing elements for, I always find, like individual time. That everything is not about a collective experience, but that in the collective experience, there's space for individuals to have the time that they need to properly say what they need to say, and be safe to say it. And also to act like, when you're a facilitator, to be that person who can be their voice. Like they may not feel comfortable, but you know, if you see that there's other people in the room that are, you know, boisterous or saying their things, take on that idea as your idea and put it out there for them, right? So it's how we come to share space with each other, and how we come to support each other in that. That makes sense.
Yeah, thank you both. We have another question from an anonymous attendee, and they ask, could you elaborate on the amount of time and the importance of commitment it takes to achieve these kinds of art-based community projects? The projects themselves are inspiring, but bringing this to life requires so much work from so many people, they assume.
Yeah, I think that there's many examples of different types of ranges of time. I've had collaborations that have extended decades, and I've had collaborations that last a couple of days. And I think that you have to bring like that kind of understanding to each project, and know that you need to give it room, and you need to give it the room and space that it demands, and not try to rush a process because of some type of constraint that you're under or structure that you're working up against, and to really advocate for the needs of the people who are in that process. And I think that that's another part of the piece of the puzzle that doesn't get talked about enough, is how much artists who do this type of work are always pushing for that. You know, especially when we're thinking about changing things in the beginning stages, it's going to be the hardest because you're going through that change. And so there's a lot of times where you have to ask for things that might seem unorthodox because this process has never been done before. But it's really important to do that because, you know, like for the example that I gave earlier about the city of Calgary, that was supposed to be a 3-month residency, and it turned into a 5-year residency because that's what the community needed. And so I think that advocating for that type of room and space is really important. And at the same time, also realizing that sometimes it goes in stages. Maybe sometimes there needs to be a break in between. Also realizing people's capacities and how much they can give to a project is really important as well, because we can't always be on 24/7. So I think that it's a little bit of a balancing act. But yeah, a lot of these projects do take a ton of time. And I feel like oftentimes funding bodies don't recognize this. They have this very set up system of like, here's the money, do the thing, report on it. And we're trying to change that process because it's keeping out a lot of voices and a lot of really incredible players from being able to give back and participate in different communities.
I think Hibba got it. I think the thing that I mean, the one little comment I'll make is like about closing out projects. This is always like a little bit hard for me. But like, just as an example, that AR project that I showed, like just the AR project with the community group, that project, to get it started, took 6 months. It took 6 months just to get the project started, right? And then we had to work within some timelines of like another 10 weeks, like to finish it off, right? And then there's no funding, there's no involvement, these kinds of things. But 6 months just to start the project. And the amount of effort that takes, not just from me and the people in my studio, but the amount of effort it takes from the people at the link, the people who are the funders to try to convince other people that this is a worthwhile thing. Like we talked a lot about this. It's like, you know, people when they see the projects, they'll always say, that's a really cool project. But generally, the cooler the project it is, the more it worked outside the system, which means it took longer and harder and wasn't a lot of money to make. That's just the kind of rule that I'm also finding. I think the other thing too is about this time, you know, when these projects come to an end, and it's something that still we're trying to get better at, is like, what do we leave behind? What do we leave, right? Because when you're working with a community for so long and there's maybe not a defined end date, or you don't know when something is going to end, but for whatever reasons, because of like financial, mental health, commitment from other people, all of these things, a project finds its way to end. And it's always like, how do we end? Not end a relationship, but how do we leave a door open and leave behind artifacts or tools for the community to kind of build up what, for example, maybe we can't take on anymore, if that makes sense. I think that's a really important thing, and it's something where I can't sit here and say I have it figured out. It's something that I'm learning all the time. Because there's projects that I've worked on, very honestly, where I just felt like they've ended and I'm like, should I keep contacting them? What's my relationship with them? What should I do? Like and I know Hibba for sure has the exact same feeling of this. So it's kind of like, if you think about what we're both saying, it's like a kind of whole process. It's just a conclusion, lots of time. There's a lot of time.
I want to thank you both so much. We're at time, and that was a wonderful discussion around integrating the arts into all of the engagement processes that everybody here joining us today is seeking to do. I feel so inspired. So just thank you to you. I'm taking it as my responsibility to gather a lot of what we've heard on this, gather your questions, and to try to create a resource that will also support community engagement practitioners to do this work as well. So thank you. Duncan, can you, I believe we have just a few last announcements.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. We're just going to let you know that everyone on the call today will receive an email tomorrow with a full recording of the discussion, some links to resources or activities, as well as a few extra learning opportunities you can choose to engage with Tamarack. I'll just go over a few of them very quickly here. The first is our Foundations of Community Engagement course, where you can work with Lisa on our online platform. You can learn at your own pace and learn how to develop a community engagement activity from beginning to end. We also have a co-design workshop coming up in May that's delivered in 4 parts on May 4th, 11th, 18th, and 25th. And we also have a community innovation workshop coming up in March and April for anyone who's interested. Again, thank you so much for spending your time with us. Thanks, Hibba and Christopher and everyone else for sharing your wisdom and insight with us. And we hope you have a wonderful day.